Well, welcome everybody. Thanks for coming out in this chilly evening. It's nice to see you. Um, since French and Pickering was established by Sam and Eleanor Morse in 1967, we've worked with landowners, townships, foundations in the state and county to purchase and monitor conservation easements, create parkland and preserve environmentally sensitive land, leading to the protection of more than 13,700 acres in northern Chester County. Well, I said we were established in 1967. So if you can guess and do math real quick, we're very excited for our 60th anniversary next year, but that pales in comparison to our country. This evening marks the start of French and Pickering Creek Conservation Trust's salute to the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Our next 6 monthly lectures will highlight interesting and informative history of our local northern Chester County. With expert speakers, we'll do a deep dive into our major ironmaster family, discover a captured slave ship, and focus on our witness trees, among other topics. We're also in the process of creating an in-depth signage array for the Warwick Furnace area within our Thomas P. Bentley Nature Preserve. Our famous Cannon on Wheels has a very busy social calendar this year. We'll be making guest appearances throughout our extended region during 2026. And if you're with some organization that is interested in having an event celebrating the history and would like us to bring the cannon there for it, send us an email with your contact information, and we'll be sure to follow up with you. We'll check its calendar, run it past our cannon committee, and we will follow up. But tonight, we're focused on the John Potts family and how they became such major players in the American Revolution. We really appreciate Justin Clement agreeing to present this fascinating look back through time this evening. Justin is the historic site supervisor of Pottsgrove Manor, the 1752 home of ironmaster John Potts Sr. After earning a degree in physics, Mr. Clement went on to earn a graduate degree in early American history at the College of William and Mary. His master's thesis explored a post-war Loyalist trade diaspora following the American War for Independence. His graduate work at the University of California is on hiatus while he's pursuing other projects, with his forthcoming dissertation entitled On Both Sides by Turns: Violence, Protectionists, and the American Revolution. Most recently, he's authored the historic resource study Patriots of African Descent During the Valley Forge Encampment of 1777 through 1778. At Pottsgrove Manor, he also helms the Powering Production Project, a herculean volunteer effort to gather, transcribe, and analyze Potts business papers scattered across archives and institutions in multiple states. Without further ado, I introduce to you Mr. Justin Clement.
All right, thank you, folks. So to keep this a little bit light and conversational, I do welcome questions if you raise your hand through the talk, but please make them crisp so that we don't kind of interrupt the flow of conversation as we go along. For our online viewers, we're going to wait for the Q&A at the very end, but I promise that I will not forget you. So to give you a bit of background, Pottsgrove Manor first opened its doors in 1952. So that would be the bicentennial for the creation of the house, built in 1752. And when it first opened, a lot of research was initially put into the house, understanding John Potts, understanding the iron industry. But even after 75 years, you would be surprised how little we actually know about John Potts and his wife, Ruth Savage Potts. So John Potts, he was a husband, he was a father, a landlord, a justice of the peace, a representative in the Pennsylvania Assembly, a land speculator, successful ironmaster and businessman, but also an enslaver of African Americans. So he was a complicated individual. But for such a prominent and influential family, you would think that they'd leave behind a lot of records. And sure, when it comes to business records, there is a lot that survives. However, there are very few manuscript resources that really delve into their private lives. We just don't have letters of a personal nature, something that gives us that window into the social and familial aspects of their lives. And since Pottsgrove Manor is a home. It's a business headquarters, it's a functioning farm, but it is also a family residence first and foremost. And because of that, we really need to look at the personal. And so this gap in the archival record presents a major challenge for us. So when I talk about things tonight, I'm going to talk about different topics, but also talk about how we know what we know and how we're trying to know it better and understand things a little bit better. So where does that leave us? Now, and yeah, would probably help if I click next on the slides. Let's give this a shot here. So the Potts family left behind a multitude of different accounting records. So these could be day books or waste books, business journals or ledgers primarily. Some of them are household ledgers, others are business ledgers. So we are talking about multiple forges and furnaces, blacksmith shops, apothecary shop in one case, as well as mills and mining operations and other sorts of things along those lines. But if anyone here has done any archival research and they've opened up an account book, there's nothing particularly quotable in there, right? If you are a historian, you're looking for those quotes that jump out, that one sentence that is revealing and interesting that you can use in a text. And there's just not much there in these account books. And I cannot say how often it occurs that you open an account book in an archive and you're like, there's a lot of information here, but I just don't know what to do with it. Has anyone actually experienced that? Gone into an archive and dug through and like, well, I just don't know what to do with this source. But who here has read A Midwife's Tale by Laurel Thatcher Ulrich? Right. So this historian, Laurel Thatcher Ulrich, she took this very bare bones diary from a midwife named Martha Ballard, and she practiced what's called the New Social History. It's the school of thought that I was trained in graduate school. And what you do really is look at a wide variety of sources, all types of scraps of information, no matter where you can get the data. And in the aggregate, maybe you have demographic information that you could start to draw social connections from and start to build a larger base of information from. So even though that diary was very bare bones, she was able to analyze it and compare it to all kinds of other records, and it ended up being a Pulitzer Prize winning book. I mean, so this is a very valid school of historical thought. And we essentially have a similar problem with these records, that they're not particularly revealing in isolation when you look at one volume all by itself. But when you take dozens of these records, dozens of these volumes, and you compare them, cross-reference them, and track them over decades, suddenly things start to pop. You gain a window into the private lives of the Potts family, the iron industry workers, and the domestic service workers within the household, whether they're free, indentured, or enslaved, as well as the wider community. And really, it's through their consumer behavior. What are they eating? What are they drinking? What are they wearing? What types of clothes are they purchasing for themselves? And what leisure activities are they doing, whether it's music, hunting, or horseback riding? When you see little clues about a jockey cap for one of the Potts daughters, Martha, tells you that she is horseback riding for fun. So we see these types of things, and it's really using these ledgers very cleverly and trying to really dig into them and transcribe them that we start to gain this window into their private lives. But there are roughly 200 or more of these ledgers spread out across 5 states, plus Washington, D.C., at 19 different archival institutions. So the first problem is actually photographing everything and then using crowdsourcing techniques to gain volunteers who, through the comfort of their homes, can access the data, the pictures, the images, and begin putting this into a format we can understand. Now, we're using these Excel databases because they're searchable. We can use slicer tables to slice and dice the data and look at new ways in which we can interpret and understand these various entries. So these are entries over a 2-year period, and you can sort by name, you can sort by commodity, sort by year. There are many different ways in which we can begin to look at these things. But it really becomes very, very much a detective problem. And this is how we are trying to solve the mystery of that question. Who was John Potts as a private individual, as a family man, as someone who actually lived in that physical house, Pottsgrove Manor? So I'll give you another, for instance. We have a lot of things on the page here, but we also have to look into the gaps in the record. So we have a pretty big house, 3 floors plus a basement and a garret. We have John Potts and Ruth, his wife. They had 13 children together, not all there at the same time necessarily, because many are off at boarding school and whatnot. But if you have all these individuals plus frequently indentured servants, there were a number of enslaved African Americans attached to the household, as well as various wage laborers hired at various points in time, including, for instance, a wet nurse or a tutor. So if you have all these different individuals, this household, they could go through hundreds of candles a year. So here's a question for you. Who thinks that the ledgers are showing more than 100 candles being purchased within a year? Yeah, raise your hands if you think they're purchasing more than 100. All right, how about more than 500 candles a year? Anyone? All right, who thinks they're purchasing more than 1,000 candles a year? All right. Well, in actuality, there are 0 candles appearing in the ledger. So you look through it, and that's a mystery. But we can assume that they have access to tallow, rendered animal fat, just through the production of the daily operations. You are cooking, and your bacon fat in the morning becomes your tallow at night that you can make up into candles or burn in a Betty lamp or oil lamp of some kind. A very simple means of lighting a space. Yes. Yeah.
That name keeps appearing like that perhaps that person was a clerk or something.
I have seen the name quite a bit as well. I have a vague recollection that he was a blacksmith, as he shows up in some Mountjoy Forge ledgers as well. But do not quote me on that. The name is unusual, but I do not believe he was African American. Yeah, Aquila, a name like that, you might suspect that might be the case, but yeah, sure thing. But at any rate, with these candles, we see tallow, we can assume, but we, looking at multiple ledgers, have found beeswax purchases. We found myrtle wax purchases. So this is bayberry wax that you might see around the holiday time. But we also see in a household ledger barrels of blubber. So we can assume that spermaceti candles made from the oil from sperm whales are another source of oil that is being used for production of these candles. So we have to assume that domestic candle production is happening in the house itself. So those indentured servants and those enslaved African Americans are likely doing that because we don't have any payments to free wage laborers who might be performing those sorts of things. So it silences in the record, the gaps in the record. We have to read into those gaps just as much as we have to look at the evidence that is on the page. And as much as we can use these to look into the private lives of individuals through their social behavior, their connections, their consumerism, we can also use social network analysis to try and build connections, see how different individuals might be related to each other. And there's quite a lot of information that can be found through that type of approach as well. It's a methodology we haven't employed yet, but are planning to. So there's another added advantage of cross-referencing dozens of ledgers and volumes over a period of decades. And really that is trying to piece together the stories of those enslaved African Americans attached to the house. So over the last 30 years, there's been kind of a push at Pottsgrove Manor to kind of look at a lot of records that were microfilmed in the early 1990s. So there were about 8 volumes at the time that were microfilmed, and a lot of what previous managers and volunteers and staff members of Pottsgrove Manor have done is looking at those volumes. But we've cast a much wider net, looked at a lot more volumes, and we're starting to pick up a lot more information. So as a result, we're finding quite a lot of little details. And when you look at multiple volumes and cross-reference them, you might have a name here, and that's it. Just one name, but like, let's say, Ishmael. But then you look at another volume and you see mention of Ishmael's father-in-law, Caesar. So suddenly you have a familial connection. Then you find a Dinah Ishmael, and you theorize that might be the wife of Ishmael. And then gradually you have these little tiny pieces spread out over multiple records, and you get to start to build a family tree. And if you trace the families forward enough in time, you can actually get to the point where you see manumissions taking place, individuals gaining their freedom, and look a little bit forward from that, and they start showing up in census records. And from there, you can really begin to look at a wider variety of sources as well. So part of what we're doing is building biographies of multiple individuals. There are around 80 to 90 individuals, whether they're free, indentured, or enslaved African Americans, tied to the Potts family households or the iron industry at large. So we're talking Warwick Furnace, Coalbrookdale Furnace, Mount Pleasant Furnace, Pine Forge, New Pine Forge, Valley Forge, Pottsgrove Forge, Coventry Forge, all of these different places. And we are starting to build out these records. And as you can see, we can actually complete some fairly complex, fully filled in family trees for some individuals, like Peter and Benjamin Sebastian, two brothers from Coventry Forge, freed in 1783. Peter actually chose to become apprenticed as a cordwainer, in other words, a shoemaker, when he gained his freedom from enslavement, and he became a shoemaker practicing in Pottstown, actually the first Black landowner in Pottstown. His brother Benjamin continued in the iron industry, and we have actually been able to trace both families to the present day, finding living descendants. Similar story with Andrew Tarr. We can trace that family to the present day. They actually intermarried with the Sebastian family at one point, but we were also able to trace through these ledgers the connection that shows that the subject of this book, The Road to Black Ned's Forge, which features an ironworker named Edward Tarr, we can actually connect him to our Andrew. So we are very certain that Andrew is the son of Black Ned, the topic of this book. And so we, again, have more connections that we're able to make. So it's really kind of exciting scholarship, but it really also tells us more about the iron industry, tells us more about the social connections that are happening amongst the African-American community, again, whether free or enslaved, within the Potts network. And this really also casts a mirror back at the Potts family and tells us about them as well. So when we go back to the family, we still have some very basic questions, like the question of whether or not John and Ruth were Quakers. You would think it's a fairly open and shut case. We have a marriage certificate. The marriage certificate is very clearly representing a Quaker ceremony. You can see from all of the witnesses here that are attending, the fact that there's no minister present, there's a justice of the peace, but really it's the Society of Friends. All of the individuals who are witnessing the ceremony that lend legitimacy to the marriage. And they say that they are attending different meetings, one in Coalbrookdale, the other in Auckland. However, they never show up in any monthly meeting minutes that we have ever been able to find, whether Exeter monthly meeting minutes or Auckland monthly meeting minutes. We have found scattered references that Ruth might be attending some of the yearly meetings in Philadelphia. But the question is, as birthright Quakers, John would be a birthright Quaker, are they more or less attending meetings without being full-fledged members? That's a possibility. He donated money for a meeting house in Pottstown, but he also donated land for a Lutheran church in Pottstown as well. So he really was more concerned about promoting the development of Pottstown than he seemed to be actually interested in the religious faiths themselves. So when we look at John Potts, his grandfather was persecuted for his Quaker beliefs back in Wales. And John's father, Thomas Potts, when he first arrived in America, he was an indentured servant and also an illiterate orphan. So could not read or write. He was a butcher for a time. And when he was elected sheriff of Germantown, he's still signing his name with an X because he was still illiterate. But he eventually gains literacy, becomes co-manager of Coalbrookdale Furnace, then buys out shares in Coalbrookdale Furnace, becomes an iron master in his own right, and from there, Pine Forge, and builds up his base in the iron industry. So John Potts really is born at this moment when his father is a growing entrepreneur, rising in social and financial rank in society. So it's just a critical moment when John Potts himself is really born and surrounded by the iron industry. And as a teen, we even see that he's repairing bellows very early on. So he's definitely intricately involved with the function and the daily operations of forges and furnaces. So he wasn't just a paper pusher. He was someone who probably knew inside and out how the industry ran. Now, beyond that, we can really look at this marriage certificate as a who's who of the iron industry. If we look at some of the names, Potts, Rudder, Nutt, Savage, Hockley, Maybury, these are all names of families that are connected to the iron industry or related by marriage. And so really what we see with John Potts, his real success wasn't so much that he had inherited from his father. His success was the connections, the familial connections that he was able to build his iron industry empire upon. And a lot of those connections were gained through his marriage to Ruth. She brought together the Nutt, Rudder, and Savage family connections, very much so with Coventry Forge, as well as Warwick Furnace, which is being built in 1737, just 3 years after their marriage. So who here's seen this image? Warwick Furnace. That one should be familiar to some. Image from Henry Latrobe. So Samuel Nutt, his heirs are the ones who built Warwick Furnace in 1737. And it's only a few years later, in December of 1741, that John Potts begins managing his mother-in-law's interests at Warwick Furnace, his mother-in-law being the ironmaster in her own right, Anna Nutt. So he begins managing her interests, and then he buys, or rather rents, the half shares of Warwick Furnace owned by Robert and Rebecca Grace. So essentially, John Potts solidifies himself, his place as ironmaster and on-site manager of Warwick Furnace fairly early on in the early 1740s. And this is an interesting moment because really he uses Warwick Furnace as the basis from which his empire is built. All the other forges in which he gains shares or has just familial connections to, whether it's Glasgow Furnace, or I'm sorry, Glasgow Forge, Coventry Forge. He builds Pottsgrove Forge roughly at the same time as Pottsgrove Manor in 1752. All these different sites are connected. And really, it's the pig iron coming out of Warwick Furnace that are supplying the forges. But one thing you might not realize is that Valley Forge was originally built in 1742, a partnership of 3 individuals. One of the partners being Joseph Walker, who is actually John's brother-in-law. And so if you look at the date, 1742, this is not long after John Potts becomes the on-site manager of Warwick Furnace. So really, Valley Forge, as a forge, got its origin because of that connection with John Potts. Once he solidified his position at Warwick Furnace, Valley Forge was built immediately afterwards, and Warwick Iron going to supply that forge. Now, of course, the 3 partners involved in that forge, they all died in debt within a very short period of each other. So John Potts purchased up 2 of the 3 shares, I believe in 1756, and then the 3rd and final share in 1757. So he actually outright owned Valley Forge by 1757, and he rapidly and aggressively built it up to a tremendous rate and made it profitable within a single year. Part of the way he was able to do that is he actually moved those enslaved laborers, who were very skilled tradesmen at this point, from Pottsgrove Forge to Valley Forge. And that influx of labor, as well as some of his building projects, just kind of building up the infrastructure, made that into a very, very successful operation. So I'm sure everyone here is familiar with pig iron, the cast iron that is coming out of the furnaces, right? So you're smelting iron ore, creating various cast iron products like, firebacks, stoveplates. John Potts is actually the one managing Warwick Furnace when they first do the run of the so-called Franklin stoves, right? That happens under John Potts's leadership. But the pig iron, this is then sent to the forge to be further refined into wrought iron. So cutting out a few steps, just simplifying it a bit, you're basically melting down the pig iron and forming that into a loop of iron. If you see that little square on the ground, that square of steel or iron on the ground with a sledgehammer laying next to it, well, they take that loop of iron, toss it on top of that little platform and hammer away with the sledgehammers. And the idea here is to break off some of the impurities that has started to burn away and form on the outer side of the loop. And eventually you can form the loop into something a little bit more refined, fewer impurities, and this is called a bloom. They cut that in half, and the half bloom is what they are able to start working in the trip hammer. So this is a water-driven hammer that you see towards the back. There's a cam wheel running off a drive shaft, and those cams will catch and lift the hammer, lift it up, and then boom, the hammer comes crashing down. But really that water-powered hammer is what they're using to start hammering that bloom, that half bloom, and working it first into something called an ankeny. The ankeny is this piece of iron shaped like a barbell that you see in this print from Diderot. And it's kind of a half-refined piece of iron. In the middle, it's starting to resemble wrought iron, whereas it's still a little bit more unrefined around the edges. So the finery hearth, this is the first step in which you're producing ankenes, and this is a finished product at this stage that could be sent as an export item. But you can also take that further and send it to the chafery hearth, where it'll be heated again, and then they start to draw that out into lengths of bar iron. Both of these can be done at the forge, so they are producing at the forges both the ankenes as well as the bar iron. And the bar iron can further be sent to a rolling and slitting mill to be rolled into sheet metal or sent through these wheels that would slice or slit, rather, the sheet metal into nail rods. And the nail rods could be cut to make into individual nails. Now, John Potts himself never owned a rolling and slitting mill, but Joseph, his son, certainly did. And I believe another son was involved in Vincent's slitting mill a little bit later down the line in the 1790s. Question?
Created pick
Yes.
then sent to court, and all this hammering took place.
Yes.
And it became more pliable.
Yeah. So the question is just clarifying, Warwick Iron is producing the pig iron, that just the cast iron, and that those long bars of pig iron are sent to the forges to be further refined into wrought iron. Wrought iron has fewer impurities. You have these striated layers of carbon between the iron that gives it greater tensile strength, something a blacksmith can then use and develop into a number of different household items. Now, if a blacksmith tried just working cast iron, it would crack. It doesn't have that necessary tensile strength to be worked properly as you can with wrought iron. So very, very big difference between cast iron and wrought iron. And Warwick Furnace is supplying the pig iron to Pottsgrove Forge, Coventry Forge, and Valley Forge at a minimum. And there's also these other relationships with other iron masters who are not so much seen as competitors as they are seen as really their equals in the trade. So you see William Byrd, Mark Byrd, the Byrd family at what is now known as Hopewell Furnace or Birdsboro Furnace involved. And you will see transactions where sometimes pig iron might be sent to some of these other forges outside the Potts network. Glasgow Forge, that could receive some from Warwick Furnace. That is primarily run by the McCall family. But they're also getting a lot of iron, pig iron from Colbrookdale Furnace. Pine Forge, another one that's within the reach of Warwick Furnace as well. Now, one thing I really want to talk about is just this concept of these Pennsylvania ironworks as industrial plantations. Now, when we think of the word plantation, historically in the 18th century, that word was thrown around a lot. They would use that more extensively than we do today. But today, it doesn't just mean a large landed estate. Today, our present day usage of the word plantation usually has a more constrained definition. We usually think of agricultural communities, typically using exploited labor, enslaved labor. So if we look at southern plantations in the Chesapeake or lowland South, or even in the British West Indies, places like Jamaica or Barbados and so on, you see cash crops as a key element of these slave societies in which you have tobacco, rice or indigo, sugar or coffee in the West Indies, all of these cash crops that are kind of the primary source of income coming from these plantations. So these are various features that distinguish the southern plantations from the forms of enslavement that we see in the north. But if we really look closely at the southern plantations, they are actually diversified beyond just a single cash crop. We see grist mills, lumber mills, and even if you look at like the West Indies sugar plantations, these are heavily industrialized operations. I mean, they're boiling down cane syrup, refining it into sugar. This is a very industrialized process. So even if we look at the South or the Caribbean, there is a fair amount of industrialization involved in these plantation systems. But beyond that, industrialization is not just about mechanization. It is also about the organization of labor, often unskilled labor. That's a key component of the Industrial Revolution that takes place at the turn of the 19th century. So really, these plantation systems from the 1700s, the 18th century, they kind of resemble proto-industrial societies in small communities. Now, if we flex that definition a little bit further and look at 18th century iron production in the North, are these the equivalent to the plantation systems that we see elsewhere in the South? Now, mid-Atlantic forges and furnaces, they do employ free wage laborers for a certainty, but you often have indentured servants. These are individuals who are often in debt. They are called redemptioners in some cases because they're redeeming that debt from the transatlantic voyage from Europe to America. And the word indenture is just another word for a contract. You'll see a mortgage that has indenture written at the top in big letters, right? So the word indenture, just think of it as contract. So these are individuals who were indebted because of that transatlantic voyage to get to colonial Pennsylvania. And to pay down that debt, they agree to work typically for 4 to 7 years for free until that debt is paid down. Now, they do have certain rights that enslaved African Americans would not. They could testify in court. They have generally more ways in which they can protect their rights than enslaved African Americans could. And really, it's their time that is commodified, their time that is kind of bought and traded rather than their physical selves and their bodies. So you see indentured servants as well as enslaved African Americans working at these forges and furnaces, and they are often working in the most hazardous and physically dangerous or taxing work assignments. And we sometimes see that. So, for example, there's an enslaved individual named Hercules who probably worked at Pottsgrove Forge. And in a runaway advertisement, so he was a freedom seeker on at least 3 different occasions, but recovered twice by John Potts, then sold over to the Bird family over at Hopewell Furnace. And we don't know if he succeeded in gaining his freedom after his 3rd attempt at escape. But each of these 3 advertisements describe an injury to his eye, his lower eyelid. And if you think of that hammer at the forge crashing down and all of these sparks and these shards of burning metal flying out, all the impurities being squeezed and forced out from the metal, burning hot, some of that caught him in his face. And really your only PPE, personal protective equipment for your eyes is the brim of your hat. They kind of lower if we look at the hats, these long brim hats, that's what they're using for eye protection. But it's, you're just peeking out from the bottom of it, but it's not necessarily enough. So the fact that we see this, good example of a workplace injury. We have references of a burn injury for an enslaved African-American named Cato, who shows up in multiple records. And if you look at multiple ledgers, including Dr. Jonathan Potts's apothecary ledgers, it's clear that it took a good amount of time, 9 months, for him to really recover from those burn injuries at the very least. So my point being that, these various factors really do contribute to us looking at ironworks as these industrial plantations. It's a new way to think of things. It's been around in scholarship for a while, but really hasn't got out into the sort of public zeitgeist. So if you really think about it, these industrial plantations of the 18th century, they're kind of halfway between, the plantation system that you might see throughout the 18th century, the more agricultural plantation system. They're halfway between there and the company towns of the 19th century. They're like the evolutionary link halfway in between. Now, going back to Warwick Furnace, beginning in the 1760s, John Potts began essentially renting out many of the various ironworks to partnerships formed of his sons. And this was one way of getting them out into the industry. And you see a partnership of Thomas, Samuel, and John Potts Jr., these three brothers. And they each take various turns managing Warwick Furnace at different times, including John Jr., pictured here on the left. But eventually, by the 1770s, Warwick Furnace passes to a partnership made up of Thomas Rudder, who's married to Martha Potts, one of the Potts daughters, and Thomas Rudder's brother-in-law, Samuel Potts. So Samuel Potts lived in Laurel Lodge, the house on the right, Thomas Rudder lived at Laurel Lodge, the house on the right, and Samuel Potts lived at Snowberry Lawn, the house on the left. So it's the two of them who are at Warwick Furnace during the Revolutionary War period. Now, unfortunately, we have kind of a gap in the records. Warwick Furnace ledgers, we have surviving volumes that date from 1744 until 1770. Then they stop, we're missing volumes, and they pick up again around 1796. So the Revolutionary War era volumes are just not in the public archives. They're missing. So we don't have a lot of information to go on, but occasionally you find different little loose pieces of paper that tell us a little bit more. Of course, we have a lot of records and receipts when it comes to the cannon production, which I'll talk about in a moment. But this is an interesting document here. We found this in a deed book for Montgomery County. So the recorder or the registrar of deeds in Montgomery County was able to get us copies of this. And yeah, even though it's in a deed book, these are manumission records. We found 3 different records, and this one is from the partnership of Rudder and Potts from Warwick Furnace. We have a few names listed here. Caesar, Adam, Cato, the individual with the injured arm I talked about earlier, Richard, Jack, York, and Martha. And this says that all of these individuals had been set free sometime in the past, but this document, a formal manumission paper, legalizes and guarantees them their freedom. So here we see those enslaved individuals who were at Warwick Furnace probably during the Revolutionary War period. So when we talk about the casting of cannon back in 1776, these are some of the people who are actually physically doing that labor there. So you're familiar, I'm sure. Is there anyone here who doesn't know about the Warwick artillery? I'd be very surprised. Okay, so I'm not going to dwell on the topic too much because this is probably very well tread ground over here. But essentially, 1776, the Pennsylvania Committee of Safety contracts with Rudder and Potts to produce several artillery, these cannons being 18 and 12 pounders. A number of them recovered throughout the years, some just in time for the centennial in 1876, 4 most recently in 2022. So it's a story that, is very popular. And you might have also heard the story that they tried to bury the cannon to prevent them being captured by the British. I know there are other ideas as well that they were abandoned, but there is another myth tied to that. The idea that this bell from Warwick Furnace from 1747 was rung as kind of an alarm bell to get all the workers to scramble forward and bury their artillery. We don't really buy into that story so much, but we're thankful the myth existed, because for that reason, this bell has survived to the present day. So this actually was displayed in Philadelphia in 1876 for centennial celebrations, survives today at Independence National Historical Park, and we are actually getting it on a 2-year loan at Pottsgrove Manor for our upcoming exhibit next month called War, Iron, and Divided Loyalties, Struggles of a Revolutionary Generation. So really it is John Potts's children, John and Ruth's children, who really have this burden to decide how they respond to the Revolutionary War crisis. 13 children, that's 9 sons and 4 daughters. And they really take on all roles: military, industrialist, Quaker neutral, loyalist. One that was pretty understudied at the time I was hired 3 years ago was Colonel Thomas Potts. We didn't exactly know why he was called a colonel, but I delved into the records and discovered that he was colonel of an associator battalion. So associators, these are volunteer regiments. Pennsylvania did not have a militia act because there is a society with quite a few Quakers, Moravians, and other pacifists who would frown upon the idea of essentially required military service for every able-bodied man between the ages of 16 and 50, typically, depending on the colony. So Pennsylvania did not have a militia act in place. So Benjamin Franklin, back in 1747, formed a militia, an associator, the original group of associators, these regiments that filled that gap. And it really didn't have so much to do with colonial defense. That was the excuse. It was really more about opportunities for social advancement as officers in these local military units. So the associators, they are raised in 1776 for the new American crisis here with Great Britain. And Thomas Potts was one of those who answered the call. So you have multiple companies that are raised through the northern part of Philadelphia County. And we have all kinds of records for the repair of muskets and rifles and cleaning them, and basically trying to find every type of firearm they can, fix them, and put them into operation in the field. And I love how one of these actually has a description of fixing a dog, mending the dog and cleaning. So if anyone is familiar with something called a dog-lock musket, a dog-lock musket is the precursor to the flintlock musket. So we're talking about a firearm that is at the very least around 70 years old, right? This is an antiquated weapon. The dog is this little catch, that holds the cock back and the firelock. So this is an antiquated weapon being repaired and put back into service. So they're really scrambling, trying to find any type of firearm to get into the hands of the soldiers filling out the ranks of these volunteer associator battalions. And so we do have the names of company officers. The Pennsylvania Council of Safety was supplying cartridge pouches, bayonet belts, gunslings, scabbards, knapsacks. We have all these little tiny scraps of information that we were able to gather together. So, but really, there's not easily accessible information on this battalion. We had to comb through thousands and thousands of receipts to piece together a history of the unit, as well as use pension applications to learn the names of some of these other officers, the lieutenants within the unit. We were also able to piece together what the uniform looked like: brown coat with blue facings, so the collar, lapels, and cuffs. Round hat with a bucktail and blue band. So this is the regimental coat, the uniform that was likely worn by the officers and the NCOs, the non-commissioned officers. In other words, the sergeants and corporals. But the bulk of the privates are likely dressed in plain linen hunting frocks, just because they're a lot poorer on average in this district compared to the associator battalions raised in the city of Philadelphia. But one of the uglier sides of what we see during this time is the fact that there are confiscations taking place. Thomas Potts himself was I've got a bug on the laptop here. Thomas Potts was one of the commissioners for his district, charged with fining non-associators who are not participating in these military associations. So in practice, what that means is that they are levying fines, confiscating blankets, coverlets, and firearms from any dissenters. And these are mainly not just loyalists, but mainly Quakers, Moravians, other pacifists who are being fined or having items confiscated to support the military effort. So during this first 2 years of war, 1775 and 1776, there was the spirit of rage militaire, where military service was all the rage. And we see that with Thomas Potts. We see that with James Potts, his brother, who was a major in Colonel Attlee's musketry battalion, formed as a colony-wide unit. So we see all of that going on as well. But then we see other members of the family who are mainly involved from the industrial side of things. Certainly Samuel Potts, Thomas Rudder, the brother-in-law, another brother-in-law, David Potts Jr., married to Anna Potts, his sister. You know, they are working at Pine Forge. You have Valley Forge. They are also involved in supplying the military. So here at Pine Forge, we have tomahawks, very cutely spelled as Tommy Hawks, but blankets and linen, the linen almost certainly being made up into hunting frocks. So the forges and furnaces, they're intricately involved in supplying the military, these associated battalions raised throughout 1776. Now, Valley Forge itself, this was co-owned between David Potts, one of the brothers, and a family relation named William Deweese Jr. But unfortunately, beyond producing gun scalps, to be made up into musket barrels at the Continental factory on French Creek, you have Valley Forge being used as a supply depot for the Continental Army. And after the Battle of Brandywine, they tried furiously to evacuate supplies. You even had Alexander Hamilton and Captain Light Horse Harry Lee trying to evacuate supplies before the British reached it. But unfortunately, they did capture the forge on September 18th. And on the 22nd, they blew up the dams and burned the forge, destroying it entirely. But as it was used essentially, as a supply depot, kind of made it fair game in the eyes of the British. So beyond that, we have Dr. Jonathan Potts, probably the best documented apothecary in the colonial era because of the large number of apothecary ledgers that we have found for him. And it's fascinating because you go into like the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, there's a volume and it's just labeled John Potts. It's in the Forges and Furnaces collection. You have no idea what it is. The date range is after John Potts died in 1768. So we know it's not his, but it's somehow connected to the family. Flip open the cover and it's Latin because apothecaries, the medicine is all in abbreviated Latin, which is very hard to decipher. But we at Pottsgrove Manor have actually gotten pretty good at doing it and have some fairly good reference materials where we can decipher this. And we have learned a lot about the extended family, the Potts family, the health and healing that is happening within the family, as well as the indentured and enslaved individuals within the Potts network, and even the extended network, the Mayberries and all these other ironworking families. We see them going to Jonathan for medical treatment for some of the workers at the other ironworks. So very interesting stuff. But Jonathan, he served first as a regimental surgeon. Later, he was at Fort Ticonderoga in Albany. He's acting as Deputy Director General with the Northern Department, the hospitals there. Halted the smallpox epidemic fairly successfully, a major contributor for that. But then he was transferred to the Middle Department with the Continental Army stationed at Valley Forge. So he would have been there with the inoculation campaign against smallpox, and he would have been here at historic Yellow Springs Hospital. Now, he was primarily the purveyor general of medicines for the Middle Department, which means that he was essentially purchasing medicine for the Continental Army. He's in charge of the supply side of things. So he did that for a few years, but he got sick, had to retire from the position, and he actually did not survive the war, dying in 1781, perhaps from a disease caught from the soldiers that weakened his condition, but we just don't know. But ultimately died young in his 30s. A bit of a shame. But there is a second Yellow Springs connection for those who are interested. There is a record. I tried to find the manuscript reference itself, could not find it. But there is a reference of Ruth Potts herself. This is Jonathan's mother, coming here in the 1760s for health reasons to the springs, to enjoy the springs here. And on the left, there's this picture of a gown, a swimming gown or bathing gown that supposedly belonged to Martha Washington. So the construction is similar to a shift, if you're familiar with that undergarment worn by women, but it is actually made with a check pattern. So when it gets wet, it's a little bit less revealing, but it's kind of an interesting material culture good. And we're hoping to make a reproduction based upon this at some point in the future. But beyond that, we're also to talk about the women of the Potts family. If we think of Rebecca Potts, Ruth Potts Jr., Martha, as well as Anne, you know, the women, they are arbiters of household consumption within their households, right? So what is the family purchasing in terms of the domestic sphere, the running and management of the house? All of that falls to the women of their households. And in an age of boycotts, right, in 1774, you have the non-importation, non-exportation agreement. You have these boycotts against British goods. And the women now have a new political voice as arbiters of household consumption, as the people who really are driving the moral voice of what these households are going to consume in this era of boycotts. So to celebrate this, we are this year creating a reproduction of an Associator quilt, an original in the collection of the Chester County Historical Society. This was block printed from hand-carved wooden blocks. So it was printed and then quilted. And we're actually going to be spending this year making a reproduction. And, you know, the various stages of it, when we're not working on it, will go on display in our exhibits. So kind of fun. Now, if we look towards the end of the American Revolution, one thing to keep in mind is that Warwick Furnace, after 1776, they continued making shot and shell. They're supplying munitions to a Continental Army supply depot in Philadelphia. Coventry Forge, under Thomas Potts, also had a contract to produce blistered steel. So you have a lot of items being supplied to the Army. But when the siege of Yorktown is taking place, the call goes out to basically empty the supply depots in Philadelphia with all the shot and shell to be sent down to Yorktown, Virginia for that siege. And so we know that quite a lot of shot and shell are going directly from Warwick Furnace to that supply depot in Philadelphia. In fact, Ned Hector himself is the teamster who is delivering quite a lot of this to that depot. But ultimately, those shot and shells going on to Yorktown and contributed to the victory, the Franco-American victory over the British. So Warwick Furnace really has a direct hand in a key victory that brought Great Britain to the negotiating table, ultimately ending the American Revolutionary War for independence. So you can go on our calendar for events. I'm going to skip past this for moments of just interest of time, but we do encourage you to go to our website because we have a very ambitious calendar. You know, the exhibit coming up next month, the exhibit will be up for 2 years, but we have, you know, Dr. Potts's Wartime Garden. We've got militia muster on July 5th, an event called Independence Ignited. So a lot of really exciting things going on. Also, the Pottstown Go Forth Festival. I will personally be delivering a reading of the Declaration of Independence, representing Colonel Thomas Potts himself, hopefully on horseback. We'll see how that goes. So that kind of brings to an end the discussion. And yeah, at this point in time, we can take some questions.
Well, I have a question about the declaration being delivered to John Potts. Did he then read it to the people on his estate or?
So the question is, did Thomas Potts read the Declaration of Independence to his estate? Now, we have a record that there were copies of the Declaration that were sent by dispatchers to Berks County and I think Bucks County, but one specifically was sent to Pottsgrove. And Thomas Potts is most likely the individual intercepting that copy of the Declaration of Independence. And it makes sense to us that he would likely read it at the very next militia muster that would be taking place. The Pottstown Company of Colonel Potts's Associated Battalion was commanded by his nephew, Nathaniel Potts, whose father was Samuel Potts of Warwick Furnace fame. So Nathaniel Potts would be the captain, and at the very least, that company, maybe the Douglastown Company as well. So you might have two companies at a time that would gather together for militia muster and would probably have heard a reading of the Declaration of Independence. We've got a question from our virtual audience. Is there any known relationship between John Potts of Pottstown and Pottsville? Oddly enough, no. Two John Pottses, both ironmasters, both have towns named after them and no relation whatsoever. They are two separate Potts families that were unrelated. The other Potts family that formed Pottsville, eventually that John Pott was descended from a separate family that came up through Philadelphia, as far as we've been able to determine it. I'm going to take another online question real quick. What was the relationship between John Potts and the David and Isaac Potts houses at Valley Forge? So David and Isaac Potts are sons of John Potts Sr. David Potts was co-owner of Valley Forge with William Deweese. Isaac Potts purchased the mill lot from Valley Forge. So there's a grist mill and a sawmill, and Isaac Potts purchased those in 1772. He lived there in 1773, but then he left the management to William Deweese, and he started up a tannery in Pottstown. And he lived in Pottstown until 1785. So really, since there was only one ironmaster house needed, which we commonly refer to as the David Potts house, William Deweese lived there, and the other house was vacant. So that gets rented to Deborah Pywell Potts Hughes, who was a family relation, her first husband being John Potts's brother, Thomas Potts Jr. So it is Caleb and Deborah Hughes who rent that building owned by Isaac Potts. They basically sublet it to General George Washington. Question? Extensively. Yes. Yeah. So the question is, do we use Ancestry.com or Family Search or any of these online databases? We use it extensively to look up probate records, taxation records, even religious records, Quaker meeting minutes. All of these things we access through these various genealogical websites. We are also looking into the archives to locate records that are not digitized. But one thing we really use Ancestry a lot for is really organizing some of the family trees for those enslaved African Americans, where we're tracking the family trees to find living descendants who would be interested in what we're discovering. The idea is to get the information into the hands of the people who would get the most meaning out of it. Question up front? Yes.
If you have any knowledge of where the forge was in Pottstown in relation to Pottsgrove Manor.
Yes. So the question is, where was Pottsgrove Forge in relation to Pottsgrove Manor? So Manatawny Creek cuts through Pottstown, and essentially there was a spillway redirecting water from Manatawny Creek, which went to a grist mill adjacent to Pottsgrove Manor itself. Further downstream, there was a second spillway, and this is further down the Manatawny Creek, where there was a second mill, and that mill still survives today, the structure. But Pottsgrove Forge would have been further downriver of Manatawny Creek, closer to the Delaware River. It kind of takes a little bit of a hook, heading a little bit further east before it joins the Schuylkill River. So we have a very approximate idea of where it was. It's basically underneath the Montgomery County Community College parking lot. In Pottstown, yeah. Yeah. Online question or comment. My ancestor was an indentured servant in Berks County in 1732. Are you aware of any I'm sorry, I don't have my reading glasses on. Dray bill, please, in Chester County or in the iron industry. I do not know, but you are welcome to email. We do take queries, but if the query takes more than 5 or 10 minutes, we do have research fees since our staff is spread pretty thin. But ultimately, yeah. We can always do a quick look up and see whether or not a name appears in any of the items that we have transcribed so far. So this information is being recorded. Will this be made available? Penny?
Yes.
Yep.
All right, so this lecture will be made available later on. And do we have any more information on Elizabeth Potts and Joseph Walker? So Joseph Walker being one of the 3 partners of Valley Forge. And we also know that Elizabeth Potts, this is John's sister. She's one of the witnesses on the marriage certificate of 1734. So, we have some biographical information. Honestly, we mostly rely on some of the published accounts or genealogies that are available on the Potts family for that branch of the family. Question?
Did the British who was making the iron, the families, and did they have warrants for the rest and things like that?
Right. So the question being, did the British know that who was producing the artillery or armaments for the Continental cause, and were there warrants out for their arrest? And the answer is they almost certainly knew. I mean, Joseph Galloway was a very close friend of the Potts family, and he's also the most prominent loyalist in Pennsylvania. And he's an ironmaster of Durham Furnace, right? So Joseph Galloway was also very close friends to John Potts Jr. He's the one out of the 13 who was a loyalist, at least the one who was not just attainted to treason, but had Laurel Lodge and all of his property confiscated, and ultimately ended up being briefly exiled to Nova Scotia. I mean, he left with the British Army to New York City and evacuated again in 1783. He did get pardoned and return, eventually settling in New Jersey. So, the fact that John Jr. was a loyalist, the fact that Joseph Galloway, the most prominent loyalists in the entire state of Pennsylvania were loyalists. They definitely knew who was responsible for this. And that may be why a lot of these ledgers from the Revolutionary War era are missing today. They might have destroyed them, just kind of burned the evidence. But ultimately, yeah, we are not exactly sure when they knew it, but they knew it. Warrants out for their arrest. The military wasn't acting on warrants so much. So, Dray Belbies. Sorry for the pronunciation. My apologies, Amy. And question being, where are the Pottses now? And the answer is pretty much everywhere. There are literally over 10,000 Potts descendants. And they are scattered all across the nation and probably world at this point. So there are some volunteers over at Pottstown Historical Society that attempted to trace out these various lines, and that's a pretty good estimate. Somewhere north of 10,000 descendants, which is a lot. But as you can imagine, if there are manuscripts in the Potts family that are out there somewhere, so when we look at these 19 different archival institutions and find gaps, the possibility is that these records survive, but they're still in the hands of the Potts family, and they're kept as heirlooms because they're directly related to the American Revolution. That is a real possibility. So recently we have stepped up our efforts to contact and reach out to Potts family descendants and see whether or not they have any of these items and might be willing to kind of let us photograph them and share resources. So that is also another ongoing project. So we have a lot of things going on with the grand scope of the Powering Production Project, a lot going on with our program calendar this year. And I really invite you to go on our website, look up the volunteering opportunities if you're curious, but also just look at our event calendar and see if anything excites you. We would love to have you, and I very much appreciate all of your time today. Thank you.
Thanks. Well, you're welcome to come up and ask him any unasked questions. And just to repeat This lecture, as well as all of our lectures, at least going back quite a while, are available to watch anytime. Just go to frenchandpickering.org, and across the top, I think it's library. And then you'll see the lectures and things all lined up there and some nice graphics. Just click them and have them on. I talked to one lady the other day and she said, "That's the greatest thing, this kind of weather. I'm just stuck inside. I'll just put one on. It's like someone's talking to me and telling me a story while I'm doing stuff around the house." So no judgment, just enjoy. And it's a resource for you, just like you all are. So thank you very much, Justin. We really appreciate it. Thanks again.
Yeah.